Welcome to the Systems Room. I'm here to uncover what really drives a great culture. Today, we're cutting through the slogans because every leader says they want trust, ownership, and innovation. But why do so many teams fall short? My guest today has lived these transformations, Aloysius Carl. Aloysius, let's start with the tough one. If every leader claims they want a great culture, what's the gap between saying it and actually getting it?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on, and thanks for the great question. What's the difference? Well, the difference is everything. It's intent, it's action, and behavior. What many leaders, I think, do is they hope that stating it, demanding it, kicking it off, and having a session means change will happen. And that's not how it works. Change happens in physical, experienced behaviors and engagements that are repeated regularly throughout the day with all the employees and the leaders. Until that happens, the culture will never change because those are the things that actually drive and create the culture. And so leaders get that part wrong completely. They just distance themselves from it. I can only draw conjecture as to why. One of them is because that's the difficult part. Doing something day in and day out and making regular changes and being committed to it takes a lot of effort and a lot of focus. But saying it by itself is never enough, and it will never make the change work.
That's a sharp point. So let me press you on that. When you've led culture change, what's the first concrete signal you look for to gauge what the system is actually teaching people beyond what leadership says?
Well, it's all about how decisions are made, if people are invited to the table and feel they have a voice, if the why is shared with the team members. That's probably the first one because sharing the why isn't a big sacrifice. It's not giving people a lot of power. It's just giving them respect and sharing the strategy and the reasons why something's being done. If sharing the why doesn't happen, then those other things, there's no way those are going on. So I'd say that's the first big symptom that there's problems in having an open culture.
So you're saying if the why is hidden or absent, that's the first clue the system is likely teaching something other than trust or ownership?
Yeah,
Now, have you?
more than likely, yes.
So let's dig into that as we go, where intent and system reality diverge. I'll keep pushing us into those specifics. Let's show exactly how leaders can see what their system is really teaching. All right, Aloysius, let's take it deeper. When you saw a system teaching people caution instead of candor or permission seeking instead of ownership, what had to change in the system before behavior changed?
Well, the first question is what was driving the existing behaviors in the first place? So when there's caution in the system, or let's say the people are risk averse, what actually teaches that and causes that? Well, one of the key signals there usually is second guessing. It's where leaders second guess every decision that was made without them. Or a lot of times it's when a decision was made and initially it looked like a good decision, but things didn't work out. And then it gets judged harshly based upon the outcome and not basing it upon what was seen and known at the time the decision was made. So second guessing happens quite a bit too. And then another thing that happens is when someone takes a big risk and it doesn't work out, and we knew it was 50-50, but they get ridiculed for the wasted money and effort. Well, how many 50-50 chances succeed? Well, it's half. That's why you call them 50-50. So it's those kind of harsh judgments and reactions that cause risk aversion and safety seeking in employees and team members.
So, what you're saying is that if leaders want ownership or candor, they can't just ask for it. They have to change how they react to decisions and risks. All right, let's break down one of those specific examples. Let's focus on ownership. Tell me about a time when a system was teaching protection instead of ownership, and what levers you adjusted to shift that.
Well, I don't know if I'd call it protection. It would be, lack of courage, right? Not taking on risk. Well, I would like to go back to a company that I actually ran at the time called Kreller Business Information Group. And I decided at the time that I was the bottleneck as the president and leader of the company, and that I needed to open things up. And we needed to make it where people could experiment and test a lot more openly and without such worry that they were going to get rebuffed. And so I instituted a number of simple rules. The one was, as long as it's a small risk and you're not risking our reputation and there's a good chance that we can deliver and that you don't promise it and the customer knows that it's an experiment, then have at it. And I turned my whole team loose with that. Now, they didn't believe it at first, right? Because it was so different from what we were operating with before. So that's when I realized that when a leader makes a big change like that to change the culture, you have to be extremely overt about it. You can't just say we're going to change. And just modeling the right behavior when that actually happens isn't enough either. You have to kind of push and coax and coerce the people a little bit, and then really recognize and reward the first efforts, even if they fall flat on their face, as long as they were a good attempt and a good effort and done in the right way, and you learn something from it. And so those are the type of things that you have to do if you want to instill ownership. And the other thing is, if somebody owns something, that means they don't just have the responsibility, they actually have some autonomy and authority to make decisions and change things. Otherwise, that's not ownership. That's just delegation of an impossible task with a thankless result. And that's what a lot of business leaders do. They talk about, well, you own this, but they don't really mean it because they don't let the people make key decisions. They don't give them room. You can make decisions from this to that. They still hold all the decisions, but they make that person responsible when it doesn't work. Who really wants that job or that position? I know I don't.
That's a concrete shift. You didn't just demand ownership. You gave people the authority to take small, smart risks, and you backed it with real autonomy. So let's push that further. How did you handle the inevitable mistakes, and what did that teach the culture next?
Well, the first mistake, I actually applauded it. Said, great job. I told the team why it was a great job. At the time, we knew this, and this. We thought this, but we weren't sure, and that's why we tried it. We did a test run, and what we learned was this, and that going forward, we'll sit there and try this other thing out, because now we learned what didn't work, and I actually accoladed the effort and the learning. That was the thing. If you want people to be innovative, there's going to be failure. If there's no failures, there's no innovation. Jeff Bezos says that. Elon Musk says that. All these great innovators say it. And I say it too, because it's true. And so you have to reward people for the behavior, not just the outcome. That's a key thing when you drive cultural change.
So you shifted the focus from outcome to learning. That's how a system teaches people that taking thoughtful risks is actually valued. All right, let's move forward. What's the next system lever leaders often overlook after that?
After what? I don't understand the question. I need a little more context, please.
That's fair. I'll clarify. After leaders embrace learning from mistakes, what's another system element that, if overlooked, can undermine the culture shift, like incentives, decision-making, or consequences?
Well, all of it alters the shift. But the more important question is, where are we now? And where do we want to get to? That's the first. Then the second one is, what cultural things exist in our system, behaviors, patterns, rewards, and recognitions that are driving what we see today and need to be changed to drive what we want tomorrow. That's how leaders need to think about cultural change. We hear culture eats strategy for breakfast, how important culture is. Culture is one of the most important things. And leaders all say they want a great culture. Well, why aren't they learning and teaching themselves about what a culture is and isn't, how you create it, and what are all the things that help drive it? You have to know all these things to enact change in something. And yet they'll stop and they assume HR will handle it, my middle manager will handle it. Well, no. Who's the orchestrator and the architect? That's you, the people who own the strategy, because the strategy is what drives the system. And the system and all the behaviors that take place and engagements in that system are what actually drive and become the culture. So you need to be aware of, understand that, and then you need to understand human behavior and how it all interacts. That's how you drive to a culture intentionally and hit the culture that you're actually targeting. And another important question is, why do we want this culture? What are we looking to get out of it? So many times people say, we want an open culture. Well, the first challenge I would have to them, well, why? Why do you want an open culture? What are you looking for? What do you think you'll benefit from an open culture? You have to be careful about what you want and make sure what you want is actually really what you want and it's going to drive and the outcomes are going to be what you want. And so you need to ask those questions and you need to understand them.
That's the level of depth we want. We'll keep pressing those why questions as we move forward. Let's keep this going. Let's talk about that problem gap. When you've seen a leader's stated values diverge from what employees experience daily, what were the most common patterns that eroded trust, and how did you rebuild that trust systemically?
Well, this is a big question in a big area. And it's an area where leadership authority and trust can be quickly lost. And it's pretty simple. So let me tell you a story about when I was at a large consumer product company. The CEO was on a town hall and he said, we want an open and sharing culture. You can reach out and share anything with me, concerns, suggestions. We're open. I want us to be an open culture. And none of us really took that seriously, by the way, except a handful of people, or maybe the younger people. One person who did was someone who had been there less than a year. And this poor, naive young man actually took the CEO at his word, sent an email. He noticed a few opportunities that he thought were great opportunities, and the company wasn't doing anything about it. And he asked, well, do you see these? Is there a reason why we're not pursuing them? Well, it took less than a full business day before the world came crashing down on this poor young man's head. The next day after this happens, the senior VP's over there talking to him, and you could tell the senior VP with their body language was not happy. I worked on the other side of the room in a totally different department, but I saw this going on, and so I asked somebody that worked with this young man, and they said, oh, that town hall yesterday where the CEO said this? And I said, yes. And they said, well, let's call him Will. Will took him up on his word and fired off an email, and now Will's getting rebuffed. Then shortly after the senior VP got done meeting with Will, we look over, and then there's the VP. And then after the VP meets with Will, then there's the senior director. So everyone that sat on the floor in visible territory of Will saw and knew what was going on. The rumors spread quick and fast. And so, unlike most of people, I wasn't just talking about poor Will. I felt sorry for poor Will. Here's a young man who just takes the CEO at his word. And now he's really sorry about it. And there's people thinking it's going to impact his career. And maybe it did. I have no idea. But should he even feel that way? And so I went and talked to him and I said, hey, I understand things have been a little rough. We get into conversation. And he goes, man, I can't believe it. It was just a simple set of questions. I didn't insult anybody. It was professional. I really took care in what I said. And I go, well, let me ask you this. Of all those people that talked to you about this, did any of them ask you or talk to you about the merits of what you brought up or your topics to say if they were insightful, right, wrong, or explain why we would or wouldn't pursue them? He said, nope, not one word was mentioned about them. That all that was said was, what were you thinking reaching out to the CEO? And why wouldn't you go through the chain of your command? Did you even talk to your manager about this first? And so... And, Will's like, well, that's not what the CEO said. He said we were open and anybody could send anything to him. So I did. And there, poor Will. What lesson do you think Will took from this? Do you think the message of the system was that we're open and sharing and you can go to any level of leader and bring up ideas or topics? Or do you think Will and everyone else that saw this happen was that you better watch out? That was a big mistake. And if you do that again, you're going to pay for it really bad. What do you think was taught?
You've made it crystal clear. The system taught caution, not candor. That's the gap you're pointing out. What leadership says versus what the system actually enforces. Now let's talk about how to fix that gap in practice.
Well, The first thing is leaders shouldn't make overt statements like that unless they have it in the system where the system's going to try to protect, support, and encourage that behavior. You have to be very careful about this. You could say, we would like a more open culture. That's perfectly fine. Saying you would like a more open culture doesn't state that one actually exists and people understand it's a go-to goal. But if you say we have an open culture and you can do this, then you have to support it and it has to be there. And as soon as it's not, what's that say? It says either the leader's out of touch or is fake and is just throwing lip service and they don't really mean it, or you can't believe them. Which one of those is a good viewpoint for your leadership? That's the question. Which one? I don't think any of them are.
Agreed. Leaders have to align words and systems, or trust erodes fast. Let's keep moving. Next question. When you've seen a system start reinforcing the right behaviors, whether it's ownership, candor, or innovation, what measurable shifts did you see in team performance?
Well, first of all, it all depends on what you're shifting to. So you're asking a very general question. It needs to be more specific. So that if it was a fairly closed system and it's getting more open, what are some of the benefits you see from that? Or if it's a wild and woolly system that needs some control and you exert more controls, what does that give you? It all depends on the change and what you're driving. So, but let's talk about when I gave our employees more freedom, more authority, and more autonomy. They felt empowered. They felt like the business was partially theirs. They did own more than just a job. They had a voice, and it really drove behavior. And that was part of our big growth period. And the thing is that change actually led to a huge discovery by one of the sales representatives, Scott, which actually changed our whole company's focus after a few years. He brought this great idea. We went and explored, did research. I did a lot of the research. I kept him involved. He actually leads that now in that business, and I've long time ago sold out. But it basically totally changed the focus and direction of the company. And I don't think it would have happened if I wouldn't have had that openness, autonomy, and freedom and flexibility out there. And Scott found a great opportunity, brought it to my attention. We really went after it, and it changed the whole direction of the company. And that has also led to a huge growth spurt in our sales, revenues, and profits. And so that's what I think was positive outcome of that. And here's the thing. If all your employees were ambassadors of your company and looking at ways to improve the company, how many more great ideas do you think would be positioned for potential opportunity? Most companies never come close to leveraging the brilliance that's in them because most of the employees feel what's the point?
That's a powerful example. Empowering people systemically turned a cultural shift into tangible growth. I'll keep asking the tough questions so we show how systems produce real results. Let's keep going. Let's tackle leadership reactions. When a leader's immediate response to a situation contradicts the stated values, like punishing a reasonable mistake, what's the first step to recalibrate that reaction to reinforce the culture shift?
Well, first of all, once the leader does that, there's no recovery, especially in that instance. The best thing they can do is stop, admit that they were wrong, admit that the best course of action is to do this, and then to do it. But that moment's been lost. You don't recover those. But the recovery will be on the next one and the next one and the next one. The hard part about change is the employees, the people, they need to see it repeatedly, not just a couple times. If it's done a couple times and the leadership reverts, you're lost because that's what they expect. They need to see it repeated and repeated and repeated. After they've seen it repeated about 10, 11 times, then I think they start believing it. And still then, it needs to be repeated more. Until it becomes a regular and repeated pattern, then the people take hold, they believe it, it becomes a part of your culture. That's why cultural change is not something simple. It takes time. I remember when they challenged me with doing cultural change in a large global organization with 10,000 people. My senior VP, I believed, had unrealistic expectations, of driving change. And I said, so how long do you think it'll take us to change our culture? He said something like 6 months to a year. And I started laughing. And he goes, well, I read about this thing where, it only takes 21 days for people to change their habits. And I said, okay, let me stop you right there. That's not real science. That was an observation made by a surgeon. I've only found one study that's done any kind of extensive studying, and it came with college-age people. That's people who are young and willing to flex. It was regarding a habit they wanted to do, and it took anywhere from 13 to 283 days for these people to change their habits. I said, now that's one person with themselves doing something they want. Now tell me, how long do you think it'll take to change a culture of 10,000 people with a lot of those people not wanting to change? And he just looked at me. I said 3 to 5 years. That's the reality. And I said, it'll go faster if all the leadership gets on board and models it more quickly, and does the right behaviors repeatedly early on. And the less that happens, the longer it'll take. So that's how it works. And there's no set formula, because everyone's different. And so is every company and every team and every culture. So that's why when you start a new business, you should be really intently focused on what culture you're going to need long term, and what it takes to create it, and how to create it, and how to continue, and how to support it. Because whatever culture you wind up with after the first few years, you're going to play hell to change, and it's going to take a lot of effort.
That's the truth. Cultural change isn't a quick fix. It's systemic and long-term. I'll keep asking these tough, specific questions, so we lay out a clear, reality-based path. Let me know when you're ready to pivot.
Go ahead.
All right, let's break down decision rights. When you've seen systems that claim to empower people but still centralize decisions at the top, what specific steps did you take to push decision-making authority further down? And did it stick?
That's one of the toughest things to do, especially in a big bureaucracy. So it's easier to do the smaller the number of managers involved. It's the managers you have to work with. And they have to sit there and let their employees make decisions and then not second guess them. Now, some managers are better at this than others, and they think like you have to give them all decisions. No, you can say you can handle decisions up to this much of authority or this much impact, and then the other ones you bring to me. But that needs to be reasonable. But that's the first step and the first change. And then you have to really live it. That's the thing. It's not what you say, it's what you do. And there's a couple of sayings: money talks, bullshit walks, or actions speak louder than words. And that's what those are all about. And that's what really comes into play with culture. And that's what leaders need to understand. Don't say it unless you mean it. Don't mean it unless you're going to do it. And do it repeatedly. That's the simple rule of thumb that leaders need to follow.
That's a strong final principle. System change must be lived, not just stated. I'll hold off here and let you steer if you want to wrap or keep exploring a final dimension. You're in control of the landing.
No, the only thing I would say is your culture is important. It's dramatically important. It's not the only thing. You need a good strategy. You need good fundamental systems. But culture then comes in, and it's one of the 3 primary things that will determine your success or not. And your systems and your leadership is part of the system, by the way. And leadership behavior is part of the system. You can't just carve it out and say, well, no, the system. Leaders are part of it. And leadership's actions and behaviors are a critical element and component. And then the system needs to support it and actually carry that out. So whatever behaviors you think you need, and whatever elements to your culture you want, you need to make sure that your system is going to enable, allow, and support them. And if it's not, and you can't guarantee that, then I don't even think you should make the effort. Because it's much worse to say we're going to be something and then fall flat completely on your face and look like you're totally out of touch than it is not to have tried at all. But if you believe you can make the changes, then go for it. Because you should be intentionally designing your culture just like everything else in your business so that it maximizes your opportunity of being successful. That's what it's all about. And culture is important because hopefully it gives the employees a great place to work. But if the employees have a great place to work and the business fails, how long will they have a great place to work? So a culture has to be where it's a great place to work and maximizes the opportunity for positive outcomes. And that's how I look at culture from a performance base and business base. It's not just about the people, it's about the people and the business. It's that right balance. We need both. We need a great culture. We need great outcomes. We need to find the right balance in where all that can thrive together. And that's what leadership's job really is.
That's a grounded wrap. You've made it clear that culture isn't just a feel-good concept. It's a system-driven, performance-critical element. With that, I think we've dissected this thoroughly. Whenever you're ready, we can conclude this session.
Okay, ChatGPT, why don't you wrap it up?
We've covered the full arc, from the gap between leadership intent and system reality to real examples of shifting culture through behavior, authority, and consistency. Remember, the system always teaches culture, whether you intend it or not. Thanks for sharing your insights, and we'll end it here.
Thank you, ChatGPT.